So Amy's going to speak about the fatal attraction, the sadism of anti-Semitism. Amy is a professor of political science and the William Weber Chair of Social Science at Kalamazoo College in Michigan. She graduated from Brandeis and received a master's and PhD in comparative politics at New York University, NYU. She's received numerous awards from her scholarship, including 2 Fulbright grants and a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities and a grant from the Sassoon International Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism at Hebrew University. She's worked on behalf of women's rights and against anti-Semitism in the United States and within Europe for over 3 decades. She has lectured, published widely on the response of states and the European Union to issues of citizenship, migration, violence against women, sex discrimination, and anti-Semitism. She's published widely, including 4 books, The European Union, Anti-Semitism, and the Politics of Denial from the University of Nebraska Press in 2014. And in addition to this, I'll just say, those of us who engage in the study of anti-Semitism pay a price and are at the forefront of a struggle. And when you speak out in the academy, you're actually sanctioned, you don't get promotions. It's a struggle, it's a real struggle. And Amy has been a strong voice rallying those of us fighting anti-Semitism in the academy, and she's a very important colleague, comrade in the struggle against anti-Semitism within the academy. So Amy, it's great that you're here and honored that you're here.
I'm honored to be here, Charles. I'm really honored to be here, and I thank Charles and Ira and so many of you for the organizing that you do on your campuses and the time that you're taking to be here. It's not often that one's provided the opportunity to talk about anti-Semitism in a way that really implicates sexuality. And when I say sexuality, I'm not one of these folks who's going to say that I'm talking about sexuality and I'm just talking about women. So it's not that kind of lecture. I'm not going to talk about gender and talk about motherhood. I really do mean sexuality. And what I hope to do is to provide a brief historical account of the growing convergence between 2 social movements. The first social movement that I'll be addressing really is the queer movement, which claims to be a more radical movement than its predecessor, the lesbian and gay rights movement. And then I'm going to be talking about the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. BDSM is a social movement, and when I say BDSM, a lot of the time I really am focusing on the boycott against Israel. But some of the time when I'm talking about BDS, I am really referring to, as many of its advocates would as well and have done, I am also talking about bondage, domination, sadism, and masochism, and they know that, and it's an inside joke. So when I'm talking about the convergence of these 2 movements, many of the people who are the proponents of both movements, who stand at the forefront of this direction that anti-Semitism is taking, are very much in what I will refer to as BDS1, bondage, domination, submission, and masochism. An analysis of that convergence between these 2 movements reveals sexual politics at play, one that masks anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism as principled politics, or in the words of David Patterson just yesterday, righteous politics. This politics is most often evidenced in allegations of pinkwashing. So pinkwashing is where I'll begin this lecture. Pinkwashing was initially used by American breast cancer survivors in 2001 to describe and then condemn the corporate profiteering that resulted from campaigns to sell women lots of pink-colored commodities on our right, while ostensibly claiming to raise consciousness and money for women with cancer. In response, I think, to compassion fatigue, corporate profiteering and corporate trivialization that resulted from these kinds of efforts, to say nothing of the cancer-causing chemicals made in their production, women's advocates throughout the United States encouraged the public to ask critical questions of corporations before consuming commodities from them. It was called Think Before You Pink. A decade later, BDSers appropriated the term pinkwashing for their campaigns specifically directed against Israel. And now we've got this. They insist that, thank you, they insist that the state's involvement in and support of the rights of lesbians and gays serves to pinkwash, by which they mean conceal or deflect attention away from the oppressive treatment of Palestinians. BDS's appropriation of pinkwashing from feminist activists marks just one of many appropriations that I hope to explore today. It is a discussion that looks at sexual politics, and a discussion that has to do with the ways in which there are the seductive pleasures of contemporary anti-Semitism. Now, years before, corporate executives bolstered sales through gender-conforming promotionals to women, American gay men openly embraced the colored pink in defiance of gender roles. This has since been, unfortunately, because we live in a male-dominated environment, the proposition is that this embrace of pink covers women too, not least of those whom are lesbian, which is kind of unfortunate and a very male-centered approach to LGBT rights. So this move was, however, I think most clearly and unfortunately expressed in the adoption by this movement of the pink triangles that Nazis used to facilitate and denote the destruction of gay men whom they identified as homosexual. That this exclusive male symbol came to signify gay and lesbian rights is disturbing, and whether its adoption resulted from masculine myopics or ignorance, historical ignorance or choice, the expectation that a Nazi badge might be reclaimed as a marker for gay male liberation and visibility signifies the second appropriation, one that is incredibly Orwellian, that I'm going to ask us to consider. By 1987, the Nazi symbol gained further prominence when ACT UP, the AIDS coalition to unleash power, used the pink triangle for its logo. Founded by Larry Kramer, ACT UP's mission involved combating the public's indifference to what it referred to as the AIDS Holocaust. His book, as you'll see, Reports from the Holocaust, The Making of an AIDS Activist, analogized the public's apathy and government's indifference or inaction towards HIV with the willful destruction of European Jewry. Such strained analogizing marks the third, and I think no less troubling, appropriation. And as the HIV death toll mounted across the globe, you saw things like you see in the far right here, AIDS equals genocide. Equating the epidemic with Jewish genocide became that ubiquitous, so much so that activists since have rarely wavered from their position that the United States and other governments' callous indifference to and inaction regarding gay men with HIV is tantamount to genocide. 3 decades later, I think what we have is the following. Efforts to boycott Israel have benefited from a generation of activists so steeped in identity theft from women, Orwellian symbolism, and strained Holocaust analogies that they seem blissfully unaware that their chants such as from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, actually mimic the eliminationist ambitions of European fascists of the last century, and you'll note on your right, far right-wingers in this one who chant, "The Jews will not replace us." Unsurprisingly, perhaps, the connections between ACT UP's Agitprop and BDS were forged in part than Sarah Schulman, one of ACT UP's original and few lesbian founders. And in a 2011 New York Times op-ed that was entitled "Israel and Pinkwashing," she writes from the third sentence down, "After generations of sacrifice and organization, gay people in parts of the world have won protection from discrimination and relationship recognition. But these changes have given rise to a nefarious phenomenon, the co-opting of white gay people by anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim political forces in Western Europe and Israel." So in reading this, I wonder how it is that hardworking LGBT activists pursuing recognition and pursuing rights are part of a plot somehow to undermine Muslims and immigrants. How is this possible? How is this possible, particularly when one recognizes that not all Muslims and not all immigrants are heterosexual? Indeed, Schulman ignores how within Israel and so many Western states, relationship recognition actually provides both Muslims and non-Muslim immigrant partners of gay and lesbian nationals relatively swift legal entrance, residence, and rights. These are very real. And yet, in one fell swoop, Schulman's anti-racist pretense enables her to ignore these folks and also invisibilize, absolutely invisibilize, Western Europe's and Israel's racial and ethnic minorities while reducing the rights of so-called gay white people to little more than a public relations exercise that somehow conceals the continuing violations of Palestinian human rights behind an image of gay hipsterism. And having then nearly forgotten about the political forces across Western Europe or the corrupt leaders of the West Bank or Gaza, to say nothing of Islamists whose hatred of LGBT folk is manifest in the dozens of states that criminalize these people and never mind renders death an alternative to their being out. Nonetheless, she places Israel in her crosshairs for, quote, harnessing, her term, the gay community so as to reposition its global status at the expense of Palestinians. What is her evidence? This. In 2010, Tel Aviv invested millions in branding Tel Aviv as an international gay vacation destination. And how did it choose to do this? Through film screenings at gay and lesbian film festivals. While such expenditures, I have no doubt, certainly frustrated many Israelis, some of whom may actually have preferred for the money to go directly to LGBT communities within Israel, one should also know that this is precisely what happened. In 2015, when the Israeli government thought that it would spend 11 million shekels on painting a plane in the rainbow flag, Israelis protested. And their democratically elected politicians actually responded. And they responded by channeling the money back into the lesbian and gay communities throughout Israel. And that news received scant attention in the international press, none of it among the BDS activists who were talking about pinkwashing. And what is going on and why is that? And the reason is because Israel's democracy is, you see, part of the problem. BDS activists like Schulman actually worry, and these are her words, that, and I quote, people of goodwill will mistakenly judge how advanced a country is by how it responds to homosexuality. Now the question is, why would this be so problematic? If the metric by which one assesses the health of any country is how it treats its LGBT population, whether or not it aspires to universal rights or an embrace of liberal democracy's ambitions, if these are the optics by which we judge, by which we assess any regime's health, you have to realize then that Islamists and their apologists will lose, and hence the ongoing efforts from the BDS to alter the metrics so that they can alter the optics. Rather than request improved standards for rigorous cross-national comparisons, and by the way, we can have various disagreements, and we should welcome them, about what constitutes meaningful, what constitutes substantive rights for any group. Might it be same-sex marriage? I'm not so sure as a feminist. But rather than engage in rigorous assessments of how it is that we would measure what rights mean for anyone, and whether it is whatever conclusions that we reach as we come to an assessment after we've come to, after we start thinking about how do we measure this, I would assume that the marked differences between Israel and countless other states that legally discriminate, put to death, criminalize LGBT folks, would mean that Schulman and her BDS companions would not be in a good spot. And so one of the things that they're doing is they ridicule such efforts to take these rights seriously as homo-nationalism. Homo-nationalism, for those of you who might not have heard this term before, is a corollary of pinkwashing. And it was defined by Jasper Puar, who I'll spend a little bit of time on. It was constructed by Jasper Puar and explained by Schulman, who writes the following. Homo-nationalism is the tendency of some white gay people to privilege their race and religious identity. And what that means is Puar's homo-nationalism disparages transnational human rights activism and cross-national monitoring of rights altogether by insisting that such efforts are illusory and constitute nothing more than a means for satisfied white folks to gloat about their ostensible superiority. I have to tell you that it's really difficult to overstate the accolades that folks like Puar get for constructing this narrative. This past year, the American National Women's Studies Association in the United States honored Puar with its annual book prize for a book that just came out a year and a half ago called Right to Maim. Right to Maim recycles a lot of the pinkwashing allegations that I just mentioned, while at the same time offering incendiary other kinds of claims, only one of which I have time to discuss right now. She attributes, for instance, the reluctance on the part of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, to shoot to kill Palestinian terrorists to total malice. Again, let me repeat that because it's a hard line to follow. She attributes the reluctance of the IDF to utilize a shoot-to-kill policy against Palestinian terrorists to malice, insisting that the desire on the part of Israeli soldiers to kill Palestinians outright has been supplanted by a far more sinister desire to intentionally maim them instead, hence her title. And in this way, she reasons that Israelis exact a more protracted death for Palestinians. Thus, in what can only be described as a 21st century blood libeling, Israel's efforts to reduce casualties have been transformed by Puar beyond recognition until at last its human rights efforts, and I would add those of other liberal democracies as well, are regarded as regressive. And I'm going to make the argument now that this is hardly a novel approach. Years earlier, in 1990, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the OIC, with now 57 Muslim-majority member countries, employed a similar tactic. It employed a similar tactic against feminist efforts to simply recognize women's rights as universal human rights. That is, the OIC actually disparaged feminist efforts as racist and culturally insensitive, and then in claiming the mantle of feminism for themselves, adopted what they referred to as the Cairo Declaration of Human Rights. That declaration, by contrast to the United Nations Declaration, insists on an Islamic approach to human rights that prove consistent with Sharia law. The OIC is, as you see, the second largest intergovernmental organization behind the United Nations and has significant leeway within it. I want to make the argument that the OIC's approach, its political approach, has more recently been popularized by none other than the organizers of the 2016 U.S. Women's March, and largely as well by the favorable coverage extended to these women. Consider, for example, Linda Sarsour's enthusiastic embrace of Sharia, and at the same time, her contention, and I quote, that nothing is creepier than Zionism. That's Linda Sarsour on the far right. In making the case against Zionism, the march thus socially excluded Zionist feminists, the only group who was publicly shamed by these ostensibly anti-racist and so-called more inclusive feminists. And Linda Sarsour's colleague, Tamika Mallory, is to her left. Tamika Mallory is interesting because she cut her own political teeth, not by working on women's rights at all, but instead by co-chairing the 20th anniversary of the Nation of Islam's Million Man March in 2015. And had you told me as a young feminist that in years to come we would have President Trump in the White House and a so-called feminist march in which you have this, I would have thought you were crazy. And I'm pretty skeptical at times. This I could never have fathomed. Although the Nation of Islam had long been recognized as a hate group, the march relied on the nation's brothers to provide so many of them security details. This they sometimes deny. And in early 2018, in February of last year, Mallory, with the increased confidence that comes with celebrity activism, gave an Instagram shout out to none other than Louis Farrakhan, the leader of the Nation of Islam, as the GOAT. And that means greatest of all time. Evidently, his repeated references to Jews as satanic failed to alarm Mallory or any of her co-organizers as inappropriate, though I think that Farrakhan probably crossed the line by insisting that the, quote, degenerate behavior of Hollywood Jews was responsible for turning men into women and women into men. Following the scandal that erupted from Mallory's post and the withdrawal of city marches and the objections of the trans community, that was another issue. In response, the Women's March released a statement saying in part, and I quote, Minister Farrakhan's statement about Jewish, queer, and trans people are not aligned with the Women's March principles. Mallory wrote a separate essay in which she argued that we have to all stand together to fight against racism, anti-Semitism, and Islamophobia. But nonetheless, neither statement ever explicitly condemned Farrakhan himself. Mallory's unflinching enthusiasm for the Nation of Islam and her insistence that it's been a force of good for the African American community echoes the theorist Judith Butler's earlier rhapsodizing about Hamas and Hezbollah being, quote, leftist, being, quote, progressive social movements. And these views, in turn, are not novel. For me, they're reminiscent of Michel Foucault's refusal to condemn the Ayatollah and acknowledge the over 50,000 women in Iran who marched in Tehran in 1979 for International Women's Day in defiance of Khomeini's dictatorship and his order that women veil themselves in public. This, by the way, is a really hard picture for many of us to look at because it was the last time that women appeared en masse, unveiled in public there. Hezbollah was at that time a newly minted, quote, party of God, and the men within it made it very clear, cover yourselves or be beaten. Clearly they won. Far from acknowledging such brutal misogyny, Foucault suggested then, in 1979, that feminist warnings that those women in the street were no more than antiquated attacks on Islam, a stance that now is often regarded as progressive and anti-racist, particularly among BDSers who insist that condemnations of, and they really do this now, they insist that condemnations of sexism and heterosexism within Palestinian and Muslim communities are little more than being Islamophobic. It is a position now that is in league with the Islamic fundamentalists who cleared women from the streets, whose strategic use of the term Islamophobia has since rendered Islam inviolate, and its secularist, well-meaning, and women critics such as this, bigots. Now, under the cover of anti-imperialism and anti-racism, pinkwashing too, like feminism before it, has been stolen from the women who conceived it. Wikipedia now describes pinkwashing as a variety, as you saw beginning, a variety of marketing and political strategies aimed at promoting products, countries, people, or entities through an appeal to gay friendliness. In order to do what? In order to be perceived as progressive, modern, and tolerant. And as Carrie Nelson has argued, pinkwashing accusations give license to condemn Israel while discounting all of its achievements in this regard. What are some of those achievements? The legal protection against sexual orientation discrimination, recognition of same-sex marriages, joint adoption, open military service. And then you'd have to ask yourself the question, not only why is that so terrible, but why Israel? Because if Islamists insist Israel's existence in the Islamic world is a human stain, it must be blotted out. And so we have this. For those suspecting that this is merely rhetorical overkill, consider Hezbollah's 1992 mission statement, which vows to continue a holy war, not just in terms of the elimination of Israel, but until the death of the last Jews on earth. By the way, a recent issue of Out magazine explicitly calls for the end of Judaism itself. An effective means of stirring support for this kind of war against Jews obviously involves building alliances. And with the growing demographic of young folk for whom LGBT rights are understandably very important, the insistence that Israel's initiatives, whatever their shortcomings, are a means of undermining Palestinian rights packs quite a punch, especially for social justice warriors. And they do this, sadly, as if social justice is a zero-sum game in which the success of one oppressed group is done at the expense of another. But really, what is the appeal of such politics for the self-identified lesbians and feminists and others, queers, who advance them? And to understand the appeal that there is for this movement, I think we have to move a little bit beyond Sartre's insistence that anti-Semitism provides a community. It certainly does that. But it's necessary to understand the origins of queer politics and its related celebration of BDS theorists like Puar and Butler before her. And this is where I'd like us to turn to I'd like us to turn to the origins of queer politics itself. I want you to know that queer politics took flight at the height of neoliberalism and took flight in opposition to feminists who specifically mobilized against sadomasochism and the industrialization of sexuality, the global sex industry in the 1980s and 1990s. And so here you see queer visibility is being achieved in no small measure through the embrace of a fascist aesthetic. And I don't see anybody ashamed with the Confederate cap or all of the SS regalia being named as being the racists that they are. In fact, the sporting of swastikas, whips, black SS caps, Confederate caps, fascist tattoos by many gay men and lesbians often rendered them, quite frankly, indistinguishable from the far-right anti-Semitic thugs who continued to harass and torture members of this community. This development, which isn't just in New York, was in San Francisco. This is 1988. And for those of you who think this is just the 1980s, 2011, 2013, I was in Utah. I saw very similar stuff going on in a gay pride march there only last month, in a Mormon community. Developments such as these render the LGBT community, I think, less able to identify, less able to expose, and reject the perpetrators of the harassment and violence against them. And those of us who warned against such eroticized fascism have been either ignored or scorned as moralist busybodies and killjoys. By contrast, I'll have you know, the practitioners of sadomasochism became the chic renegades whose preferences were regarded as so defiantly outside of the mainstream that they eventually curried favor within the mainstream precisely because of being seen as so defiant. Whether or not you're thinking about 50 Shades of Grey, in the middle you see Kink Ballet promoted last week in the New York Times. In the corner at the bottom, this is Bonding, a new little series that Netflix is promoting. I came over on Norwegian Airlines. There was an advertisement in it for bars that have no alcohol, but instead there were evenings training folks about how to be a better dominatrix, live tattooing sessions. So this is in Norwegian Airlines, those of you who might be flying with that. So this is just really pervasive. And I think so many of us may actually be unaware of the academic platform that made this possible, right? That the academy that we're looking at now when we're wondering about this deluge of anti-Semitism, I'm going to be making the argument that the academy was actually ground zero for so much of this. So for so much of the sadomasochism and the queer theorists like Butler, who described her, and this is years ago, nearly at that point 2-decade-long relationship to sadomasochistic discourses, and I quote her words, not mine, active and complicated. And this standpoint was particularly evident in a book that came out in 1997 entitled The Psychic Life of Power. And in it, Butler describes her paradoxical embrace of injurious names that constitute her socially. And I want to have Martha Nussbaum unpack that for folks for whom that doesn't seem to carry much, right? I mean, what does she mean by that? Well, Martha Nussbaum understood then what many chose to ignore or, quite frankly, failed to comprehend. And that was that Butler's central thesis in the book is that everyone eroticizes oppressive power structures, and because of that, can only find sexual pleasure within the confines of those structures. It is a thesis that I think in part explains the sexual appeal of Nazism and the continued use of images and implements of Nazism by sadomasochism's practitioners. So concerned was Nussbaum by Butler's influence, and this is in the 1990s. She was so concerned that she published an article condemning Butler and what was going on within Women's Studies Department in The Atlantic. And then she concluded, this is Martha Nussbaum, there is despair at the heart of the cheerful Butlerian enterprise, the big hope, the hope for a world of real justice, where laws and institutions protect the equality and dignity of all citizens, has been banished, even perhaps mocked as sexually tedious. Judith Butler's hip quietism is a comprehensible response to the difficulty of realizing justice in America. But it is a bad response. It collaborates with evil. Feminism demands more, and women deserve better. Nussbaum, 1999. While Nussbaum's analysis of Butler's detrimental influence within women's studies, which doesn't exist anymore, it's called Women, Gender, Sexuality, Queer Studies, or as Sheila Jeffries would say, the queer disappearance of lesbians and women in general. While Nussbaum's analysis of that detrimental influence within women's studies proved prescient for some, not for all of us, because we knew that Butler was heading in that direction a decade before Martha Nussbaum. Okay, I think that the person to really keep our eyes on right now is somebody younger to Butler named Alice Eccles, whose most recent retrospective on Butler was published in 2016 in Signs, and it was entitled Retrospective Tangled Up in Pleasure and Danger. And Eccles in it offers a frank reverence for queer theory and its penchant for sadomasochism that is especially useful in really understanding the context within which Butler and her countless protégés became prominent, not only within the academy, but became so prominent outside of it, particularly in inflaming anti-Semitism by calling for Israel's demise. According to Eccles, Butler is indebted to, quote, feminist sex radicals who preceded her. These self-proclaimed radicals include those like Lisa Dugan, whose energetic defense of sadomasochism and pornography in the 1980s helped to stunt legal efforts by feminists to combat male violence. And decades later, Dugan assumed the presidency of the American Studies Association, where she immediately used her position to advance the U.S. boycott against Israel and, by the way, her sexual politics. Under her leadership, the theme for the conference of 2014 was The Fun and the Fury, New Dialectics of Pleasure and Pain in the Post-American Century. Eccles also hails Gail Rubin, a founding member in 1978 of the lesbian sadomasochistic group SAMWA, now Associate Professor of Anthropology and Women's Studies at the University of Michigan. This is Rubin going back to 1982 at what was the Barnard Women's Conference. A lot of this started with, again, the promotion of sadomasochism as feminism in the 1980s. Rubin is really a very key queer theorist from whom Butler expressly draws. One of the things that she's really been important for having done is advancing sadomasochism by transforming the eponymous admirers of the Marquis de Sade into a persecuted minority. Moreover, her insistent, and I think often unwelcome, conflation of sadomasochism and gay identities and practices enabled Rubin and her peers to attack their political opponents as bigoted right-wing homophobes. So anytime that you are critical of sadomasochism, which is now conflated with gay sexuality, that's what you're accused of doing. And it's politically quite sharp because you see in emphasizing their own vulnerability, sadomasochists, like anti-Semites in general, effectively inoculate themselves against criticism and charge their political opponents with seeking to deny them rights. Although few feminist critics ever really disputed the rights of sadomasochists to engage in their chosen practices, and instead objected to the ideological propositions of sadomasochism's proponents, this distinction appeared to matter little. Queer castigations of feminists effectively succeeded in silencing women's rights activists in ways that more traditional conservatives and far right-wingers could only envy. With ambiguity a casualty of the so-called sex wars, deceptive reversals reigned. Ruben Samoa's colleague, the self-proclaimed sadist turned trans activist Patrick Califia, in this photo, transformed Nazi symbols into so-called objects of sexual enjoyment. And this is a quote. Thus he now quipped, "A swastika is not really a swastika, but a sign used to communicate a shared interest in sadomasochistic sex." Insisting swastikas and other trappings of Nazism are merely erotic signals and or parodies of authority allows sadomasochists and their countless apologists to ignore, and this is hard for many of us to appreciate, or even relish the harm that they cause in embracing these symbols. This indifference to or excitement from sadism also extended to Samoa's gay male predecessors who, in the 1930s, similarly indulged in sadomasochism until they realized that the scenarios that they were enacting, complete with Nazi uniforms, for their own sexual enjoyment, were in anticipation of greater violence and sometimes included even their own demise. And this is not my insight. This is a conclusion that was reached by the prominent gay writer Christopher Isherwood in Berlin Diaries that provided a basis for Cabaret. After compiling countless firsthand accounts from foreign tourists in Germany from 1919 to 1945, for her book, it's a fantastic book, entitled Travelers in the Third Reich, Julia Boyd concludes, I quote, "Nazi evil permeated every aspect of German society, yet when blended with the seductive pleasures still available to the foreign visitor, the hideous reality was too often and for too long ignored." So I read that last year when I was here. I started it when I was here. It's a rather long book. When reaching that conclusion, one has to ask, what exactly are the seductive pleasures to which Boyd is referring? What are the pleasures that dulled the people's capacity for outrage against Nazism? And what was it about Berlin, a left-leaning city and bastion of Nazism, that made it, in the words of many, including Boyd, whom I'm about to quote, what made Berlin so, quote, modern, innovative, sexy, and exciting? Isherwood's cabarets served as markets for prostitution, hookups, and outlets for pent-up male aggression in the aftermath of World War I and the Great Depression. An entertainment critic at the time remarked, quote, "All of the wildness came alive again, all of the malice, the joy of murder." Another explains, quote, "Here the public satisfies an instinct that's simulated elsewhere in executions, insane asylums, and bullfights." Many of the nightclub entertainers were Jews. They were Jews who told their primarily Gentile audiences degrading jokes about Jews, and in particular, about Jewish women. For those of us who are a little bit older will recognize Joel Grey in a very famous duet, right? And in it, it concludes with, "But if only you could see her through my eyes, she wouldn't look Jewish at all." These are obviously the exaggerated caricatures that play directly into the prejudices of the audiences of the time. And while few of those Jews who were entertaining could have ever imagined the ferocity, the immensity of Nazism's dangers, there were still other Jews who protested against such cabarets and warned specifically that such parodies could inadvertently provide ammunition and incite anti-Semitic violence. Among them, the Central Association of German Citizens of Jewish Faith, Germany's largest legal organization that defended Jewish rights. They regularly protested the Jews who ridiculed Jews on stage for a living. They were joined by Jewish veterans who had just fought in the war. They were joined by Jewish women's groups. Such warnings, unfortunately, made little headway. And I think that one of the reasons may have been that because there were too many who really underestimated the fatal attraction of such violence. In fact, the very sites and critics and vacationers themselves who described what they were witnessing in their accounts back home as sadistic and repulsive proved to be the very places that these vacationers flocked nonetheless. And not all of these places were in Berlin. Shortly after Dachau opened in 1933 to imprison the Reich's political prisoners, it too was a tourist attraction. And it was a tourist attraction to which American and British tourists flocked. Many of them were journalists and politicians. They also came by the thousands to Max Hirschfeld's Institute for Sexual Science, the world's first institute for the study of sexology. And while many, no doubt, visited the Institute so that they could access the Institute's extensive library holdings, attended numerous lectures, and perhaps sought treatment for behaviors that they then regarded, sadly, as being deviant, still more visitors went there to be titillated. And Isherwood's important because then, again, he describes in great detail the Institute's exhibits of, quote, intricate female underwear donned by men, overcoats replete with cameras utilized by exhibitionists, and myriad whips and chains and other implements of sexual torture. And his perceptive friend, the poet Auden, summarized this in 3 words: pornography for science. Within months of Hitler becoming German Chancellor, Hirschfeld's Institute was closed. And this was less because of the pornographic exhibitionism. I know I didn't mean to go fast forward. Maybe I should go back and wait. I'll get there. The Institute was closed less because of the pornographic exhibitionism. The Nazis were themselves very avid consumers of pornography and prostitution, and were themselves pornographers. That's not why they closed Hirschfeld's Institute. It was because he was an outspoken Jewish advocate for gay rights. And his institute went the way of cabarets in that they also closed because the Nazis eventually murdered those who first sustained such places. By the 1930s, by the late 1930s, there were few foreigners that considered the abundance of anti-Semitic propaganda around them to even be problematic. And so Boyd's trying to wrestle with this. How is this possible? And she suggests that most of these foreign tourists consider these conditions to be none of their business. And I would add, if Americans were especially reluctant to scrutinize Nazis, particularly on racial matters, it may have been because criticism regarding Jewish persecution invited comparison with the United States' own mistreatment of its Black and Asian population. Yet for Boyd, the irony in turning a blind eye was that these foreigners actually brought the very battles that they might have wished to avoid even closer for not seeing anything. And my question is, and this is when I fast forwarded by mistake, might our own reluctance to analyze sadism's eroticization and connection to anti-Semitism put us also in a very similar and perilous position? I talk about the recent conversion because this picture is of a sadomasochistic punk band that went to Eurovision representing Iceland. So this is not way outside of the parameters. This is not counterculture. This is Eurovision culture, okay? They go to Tel Aviv and they did so singing "Hatred Will Prevail." That was the song that Iceland went to Eurovision with and to Tel Aviv. And this punk band is, as you can see, very prominent within BDS. And just reading the second to the last paragraph, I mean, all of it kind of speaks for itself, and I hope brings the presentation together. You'll note that the band's other interests, besides boycotting Israel and sadomasochism, its other interests, and this is from them. It includes death, demands for an overhaul of capitalism, disdain for consumerism and society's pretensions, doomsday, and they're interested in doomsday, an antagonism for fake news guided by their political leanings, disgust at the discrepancy of income rights, and more at home and abroad. This is what's now being seen as progressive or regressive. Tempting as it may be to dismiss this, remember they go to Eurovision. This is seen in households across Europe. They're representing a Nordic country, Iceland, right? Tempting as it may be to dismiss this, to dismiss Judith Butler, to dismiss Puar for, her movement from homo-nationalism to the politics of maiming, and so many countless other so-called academic theorists and followers of BDS as simply misguided or marginal. Their influence is powerful. Their influence is powerful precisely because they claim to have so little of it. A majority of queer folk and their younger allies either came of age in the 1970s and 1980s or have been schooled in academic programs where the views of these so-called sex radicals so predominate that sadomasochism, like Islamic anti-Zionism, is regarded as central to feminism and sexual liberation itself. This is what I'm referring to as the combustible injustice that derives from and contributes to the fatal attraction of anti-Semitism. And I'd like to stop there and just take questions and comments. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I found it incredibly fascinating. My episode is still going around. So, as far as the sort of sadomasochism world goes, I know that Alice Walker and Audre Lorde were not fans of the deemed process movement within that time frame. But sort of the third wave of feminism and the mentality that sort of sits with my generation in terms of sex and sexuality is that to be anti sort of sexual preference absent of certain discriminations is to be anti the liberation of women and people who don't describe themselves as having a specific gender that they identify with.
So you know what's interesting? That took me an hour,
Yeah.
and that took you with your head spinning? Less than a minute. Yes.
Right, and so my question is sort of where I'm finding it hard to reconcile your presentation with what I understand.
Absolutely, absolutely, because this is what's being taught in the academy. So I'll say this, I want to go back. And I want us to think critically about language. I really want us to think critically about language. I'll go back to a term that you used. You talked about being, what, pro-sex?
Pro-sex.
Okay, good. Thank you. So I want you to know that in the early 1980s, when I was fighting against all of these people who are now very prominent academics, and in particular prominent sadomasochists, they were prominent sadomasochists then, Gail Rubin, prominent in BDS, iteration 2. We moved from BDSM to boycott, divestment, sanctions. I would say I'm against sexual trafficking. I'm against prostitution, putting women in prostitution. I'm against the graphic depiction of sexual slavery, because I take seriously language, you know, that's pornography. The graphics of that exchange, sexual slavery. I'm against incest, for which Gail Rubin constructed a new word called intergenerational sex. And I would have them respond to me that I was against sex. I mean, how did they know? I don't know. But anyway, they go, you're against sex? And I would say, I'm not against sex, I'm against, and I'd say, you're against sex? I got so tired of that. And some of us called ourselves wussies, women against sex. I mean, we thought it was hilarious. Like, I told you I'm against this, I didn't say I'm against sex. They have so won. You have to understand how as much as I can cast aspersions to them, they won, because they have conflated all of that with, that is sex. And you know what, I have to say, yes, if that's sex, I'm against it, but you know what, that's not. Let's be honest, that's not sex. So they can't have it, but they did appropriate it, so that now they've even done worse. They've said, if you're gay or lesbian, that this is just one of many orientations. And if I'm against it, then I'm against gays and lesbians, which is hard to be against all of those things at the same time if you stand at the intersections of these identities, right? But they succeeded. And now what they're succeeding in doing is they're succeeding in telling us, this is why Angela Davis says that the queer movement will be critical in making BDS move from a vanguard movement to a positive one. Because what they're going to do is then bring you along to thinking that you can be annihilationist in your politics, because that's river from the sea. That's no different to me than hearing, you'll not replace us. And now if I'm against that, I'm not progressive. So I would say, on a bad day, that they've won. But on a good day, because you're so bright that you can say, like, within 1 minute, you summarize an hour, because you're bright, but also you're steeped in it. On a good day, I'd say, we have to unpack that. You can't have that. You can't have my movement. You can't deny my people self-determination. You can't argue for our annihilation wrapped up as if it's progress. You can't have that. No, I'm done. You can't have that. So they've been that successful. Now let's go back to Alice Walker, who I mean, you know your history. Most people don't know that. She and Lord and others, because they too saw the connections. It was impossible not to see the connections, because these women would come with whips and chains and expect and dress up. If you did it in any other context, we would know what that was. And that was offensive to Jews, and that was offensive to many feminists, particularly African American feminists. And they were outspoken. And then what happened is what's starting to happen with Jews now. They were silenced as funny-duddies, as folks who didn't go along, because it's hard to be accused of being against somebody else's rights. And we were real clear. If you want to get dressed up like that, that's fine. I'm not telling you what you can and can't do, but I am entitled to tell you what it does to me, the hard part of it for many of us, including them, and this is when we lost so many women, is because they got off on hurting us. And that's something that I want you to appreciate. I want you to fully appreciate that when people do these things, I'm not saying never cry. Never show them that they have you down, because it's thrilling for them. And that's the end result. They're attracted to the sadism. That we're foolish if we think that this is just like we're engaging in a, we are engaged in that exchange. I welcome that exchange. We ought to have more of it. It's hard to have it though when you're castigated as a moralist busybody. And it's also hard to have this, as we all know, in a larger public where people are titillated by our being hurt, right? So if they're titillated by our being hurt, because I saw this also with Audre Lorde when she was alive, better just walk away. And that's what a lot of women did, including her at one point. So it's particularly painful that they too have co-opted her legacy.
I might even, sorry, just
Go.
last point. I might even argue that this idea of sexual gratification from the pain and suffering of a specific minority group is in relation to the idea of power as viewed through the lens of a man. And so the idea that because I'm seeking power and redemption sexually, the way that I do that is by appropriating the culture of racism and antisemitism that exists within white male culture, which is very interesting.
Yes.
Could you write that down? Yep.
So, you said something, just at the end of it, you said something that,
Yeah,
if I heard you right, which was, you said, you spun out your summary, and then you said, and this is so different than what I've been taught. Did I hear that right? Or this is so different than what I'm hearing in the academy. Sometimes you said something of that nature.
Yes.
And I just wanted to say, wow, fantastic. That is exactly what critical anti-Semitism studies are about. Because what critical anti-Semitism studies are about are, if the academy is becoming a place where anti-Semitism is comfortable, then the academy has got to be psychotic. The academy has to be psychotic. Okay? If anti-Semitism is part of what the academy is promoting and teaching and making a comfortable place for. And that is what ISGAP is here for, is to be critical of many of the things in the current academy. Because many of the things that are happening in the current academy are being couched as progressive, but they're actually regressive. And I think that's a central argument that we're making in this entire 2 weeks. In my opinion, I'm not speaking for the ISGAP leadership when I say this, that's my opinion of what it means to be critical, critical studies of anti-Semitism, is that, again, you can't, there couldn't be a place for anti-Semites, or literally a place where the academy comforts anti-Semites, and that be a non-psychotic space.
Thank you for your presentation. It was actually very eye-opening. I found that band that you showed, the quotation of what they said actually started to sound very similar to what Hezbollah was saying.
Yes.
But they were able to hide it they were very crafty in it. Anti-capitalism. The stereotype of capitalism is that it's owned by Jews. So if they're saying they're anti-capitalist, they don't want it at all, they want to destroy it. And then after that, they say they're pro-Palestine. So I'm actually seeing how sophisticated anti-Semitism has become, where even sex, they sell anti-Semitism through sex, through rights. Certain groups are now able to enjoy the pain of others and actually commercialize it. And have people who are actually seeing the links unable to speak against it because they actually are able to put themselves in protected groups which are like the group that they wish to oppress. So I found that actually it's kind of sad because I've never seen it before your presentation, but actually you'll find that in the past you did support these type of people, and you thought, no, they should be protected. But now, when you start to see the linkages of how anti-Semitism has actually creeped into parts of our lives that we never thought possible.
It's incredible. And I'm glad that you see that there is this deep connection here with the punk band and Hamas. The difference, though, is that I'm grateful to Butler in a way. She venerates that. This is okay now. And the same thing with Puar. When I read Puar, I know that I'm reading OIC material. And I say it's direct from the 1990s. So this isn't that new. I think what makes it somewhat novel is just how insidious it's become. And the real painful part is that it's being sold to us through social movements. And in particular, you see this also, we don't have time for this presentation, Black Lives Matter. Queer politics. The environmental movement. So you take any social movement, and they're particularly vulnerable to this kind of co-optation. And it's really painful if you genuinely, as I think we should, care about any of these communities or any of these issues. And then you're almost nervous of telling folks how painful you find it, because that's part of the thrill for them, you know? It's like, some of us won't cry in public, and it's not because, that's for no other reason than I just couldn't possibly give someone the satisfaction of it, you know?
Yeah, that last point you just repeated and made earlier about the sadism, that's one of the things that I took away from the BBC panorama piece, was that essentially with this 160,000 new members of the Labour Party, a lot of them were just really enjoying sticking it to Jews, making them cry, and then getting away with it. So I was thinking of that, and I was thinking that, so where's the masochism? And the masochism is in submitting to the jihadi patriarchs. So you have this combination of, turning your nastiness on the Jews who don't fight back but whine, and then submitting to the people who will really rip your head off if you defy them.
So absolutely. And here's something else, though, and I want us to tread really carefully, because you asked the question about where's the masochism. And to see young, really bright people, not all of whom were Jewish, by the way, whose lives have been dedicated to labor politics. You had two of those people say on national TV that they thought of killing themselves. No? I mean, so we have to tread carefully with the whole politics of masochism, because it really is destroying us and our allies. It's really destroying. So you don't want to be critical of masochism without then blaming the true victims of this.
A little bit confused. I want to clarify one thing. So I understand how some of the sadomasochism, the things that they're using are have Nazi origins and things like that.
And Confederate origins,
and Confederate
veneration
origins.
of slavery.
But are there parts of it that are okay according to you, or that are free from those kinds of things,
Okay.
or is it so new that it's everywhere there?
Do you want to answer? Your hand went up immediately.
Well, I don't want to.
Go. I think we should have a discussion. I'll answer too. It's not like I'm going help me here. Yeah, go ahead.
So this is something that sort of popped into my brain just now. The idea that sometimes in the pro-sex movement, people would consider pornography to be art, and this sort of art form that expresses, like any other form of art. And if that's true, and art reflects life, then what are we reflecting in these types of works?
Yes.
And so, of course, we could argue, well, pornography is art, and this is something that we have to allow, but to me, it would be the same thing as if someone was obsessed with painting the pain of Jewish people in concentration camps in a very sort of pro-concentration camp way. You'd be like, well, yes, this is art, and of course you can create that, but where is your mind in that moment? And so if I'm portraying other people's pain as pleasurable to me, where is my mind? And that's rough for me to wrap my mind around as someone who, again, grew up in sort of pro-sex feminism. But it does sort of beg the question that if we consider it art, then must we not critique it as art and not just accept it as being good just because we call it artistic? If that makes sense? I hope that sort of helps.
Great. And when I think about it, this reminds me of old questions that I get asked with the pornography movement. In other words, like, is the pornography that I like okay? Right? Or if I do it this way, is it okay? I don't know of any of us who say you can't do the following. I'm not giving you prior restraints, or to use Schulman's analogy, I'm not talking about harnessing anything or telling other people what to do. What I'm trying to get us to think about is, why is it, and I think we have to have these really honest and open discussions, why is it that we're attracted to the things that we are? We don't have to share that with each other. I don't want to be intrusive. I don't want to, render judgments on you. I'm saying that all of us have to deeply ask ourselves this question. Because when Boyd, who's not at all feminist, she had like no stake in the game. It's almost refreshing when I read this stuff, when she talks about the seductive pleasures, I don't think it's not coincidental she uses that language. And it's not coincidental that these implements this is their language, not mine, sexual triggers. I'm saying that we have to interrogate that. What is that about? And that the people who survive that, including, I would argue, women who've survived the prostitution industry, Christopher Isherwood, and the survivors of the camps who were sexually exploited while being in there as pink triangled 175ers, have asked us this question. And we don't interrogate it publicly, and least of all, not in discussions of anti-Semitism studies. And by the way, there are good reasons for that too, right? And it goes to showing the vulnerability, and that my heart really went out to the person, yes, to two of them that said in public, I thought of killing myself. I mean, this is some deep stuff. So it's not about telling people what to do, it's about really listening to each other. What's harmful, and why is it that this is thrilling for anybody? Yep.
Thank you. You've blown my mind. What Dr. Patterson has been talking about, the limiting principle of human beings, to know when something clearly is crossing a line. But you discussed the language and how the punk rock band that you put up, I mean, clearly they took all pretension of anything. Hatred will prevail, I think is what it said.
Hatred will prevail. That was a song, that's an entrance song on Eurovision context by Iceland, not the Austrians and the far right. This is Iceland.
And so I just wanted to finish, and I just want to comment with the fact that I think anti-Semitism, like Dr. Patterson, ends in this idea that you can't appropriate God. And when you do, it means these consequences, right? Because you have to love your neighbor, and that means not degrading someone.
And it means not venerating death.
Exactly.
I mean, that's what they said. What is it that they value? Death. And that goes back to this astute comment earlier, too, that, wow, this sounds a lot like Hamas. But these are co-travelers. It's not coincidental that I started with that Venn diagram. When you have the emergence of these two movements, this is the toxicity.
Do you see a parallel insofar as where Europe may have been at one point where they still would clothe themselves in a certain kind of language? And that, maybe in America, they're still walking a sort of kind of linguistic acrobatics in order to eventually fulfill the hatred will prevail on this side, in America?
I don't know. What do you think? I don't know.
I'm very pessimistic by nature.
So am I, but I could not have imagined this.
Right.
My question, and it's going to be a little hard to put together because I'm still playing with the idea, but you're talking about a culture that motivates anti-Semitism within something that is completely beyond boundaries and completely, we'll call it off the mainstream. And then on the other end, we have two phenomena. One on the masculine side, where young people from Europe and the U.S. are going to they're going to joining ISIS apprentices going to war zone to kind of get their masculinity kicked. And then we have on the female side phenomenons of women who leave their families to marry someone who's extremely on the extreme Islam, and then they get trapped there, and sometimes they're being saved and sometimes they don't. So, and I read a theory saying that this is sort of a search for like the ultimate patriarchy that is now completely gone, because everything has gone so far to the other end, where the only place where you can find like the ultimate patriarchy that is very, very solid and standing is Islam. This is what it's offering. This is the attraction. Obviously, these are end phenomenons, but I wanted to ask you: do you see some sort of linkage between them?
I think that there's a definite linkage. There are two books, one of which may not read well decades later, but one of the first people to really understand this was a woman named Andrea Dworkin. Andrea Dworkin wrote a book called Right-Wing Women, and it's very important if you really want to understand these women who are attracted to jihadists. Because what Andrea did in that book is she talked about what's so appealing, that she's writing in the 1980s, what's so appealing to so many women about these like far right-wing, and now they're like conventional in my country. I mean, they'll be like to the left now. What's so compelling about these folks? And she talked about providing women with a sense of security. I know it sounds strange, but a sense of security, stability, place, right? So she talks, but because it might sound like a little weird in the analogies that she's drawing from the 1980s. So she did that. Just before 9/11, there's another woman who wrote The Demon Lover. And that woman was Robin Morgan, another feminist, who actually wrote before 9/11 about how we are living in a society that romanticizes, that is absolutely in love with terrorists. And at that point, she wasn't just dealing with jihadists. I mean, she could be talking about the IRA here. So, yeah, those connections.
What do you think of the argument that for the, I think, taking back up what he said a little bit earlier, the kind of lesser forms of BDSM, right, between consensual partners in whatever domestic setting, what do you think of the argument that certain BDSM practices that allow for power splitting or other forms of control is actually like a safe outlet for this entertaining behavior that would otherwise not be self-regulated?
So it's the last, and please, I want us to be able to continue the conversation. I think that those so-called safe spaces were about as safe as those cabarets that I pointed out to you, right? They were spaces in which Jews could kind of explore and be avant-garde and think about how do Jews behave. And it was entertainment and it was fun. And the bars that Isherwood frequented and all that sadomasochism, it was consensual and it was fun. And a lot of the women who were hurt in these practices, including the woman whose back was carved with a swastika, who had prior consented with one of the people who I put on the screen. You reach a point, I think, where folks are seriously harmed, and everybody kind of wants to know, how far can I transgress? And I think we have to ask ourselves another very deep question. Instead of asking ourselves, like, how far can I transgress, or what SM is okay, or which pornography can I look at, what if we just try, and I know this is going to sound weird, and then I will become the killjoy of sex I know that I'm supposed to be. I don't understand why sexual equality is not sexy. I don't understand why it's not sexy not to try to get off on fascism. I honestly don't understand what the problem is. But that's me. I've just given you my sexual orientation. Thank you, and we'll continue maybe talking after.